Thank you very much, Adana and Dr. Degbanja for this platform, creating this platform. That's fine. All good. I have to, lay out certain, if you like, disclaimers. What I'm about to say is very provocative, very combative, and very controversial. But that is what this afternoon is about. We are here to debunk misperceptions about African continent. I am acutely aware of my African upbringing, which is that I am brought up to respect authority. So the names, if I happen to mention names in authority but mention them to criticize, it's not that I disrespect the authority of certain individuals, just that I am in that business of debunking misperceptions about the African continent. Before I start, I should say that I should say thanks to the owners of this land for allowing us to migrate and giving us a home here. I have been here for like 12 years now. And I am grateful to the indigenous people of Australia, and in particular, those who own the land on which I currently stand, for agreeing to allowing me to make Australia home. Recently, a young African student was wondering, these African students had attended a lecture where David Rappaport's 4 Waves of Modern Terrorism was introduced. David Rappaport is a scholar who came up with a theory about waves through which modern terrorism had appeared. And he starts by 4 waves. The first one is the anarchist wave, the second one is the anti-colonial wave, and the third one is the new left wave, and then the fourth one is the religious wave, which is what we are currently experiencing. This young, impressionable African student didn't understand why the good professor would include an anti-colonial wave and not a colonial wave. Why would you classify someone who is fighting against colonialism and use them to define terrorism, but not the one who did the colonization? To the mind of this African student, that was a bit, wasn't on for him. My response was very simple, and it's that those who did the colonization are the same ones who are defining terrorism. And as Linda's very important saying, the African proverb that she put on the screen, as long as the lion learns to ride, the story will always glorify the hunter. And it is pretty much the same reason why Catholics are not pedophiles, but Muslims are terrorists. The same reason why Peter William Botha, who led apartheid South Africa, led a white supremacist government, terrorize Africans, was not a terrorist, but Nelson Mandela, who was fighting against apartheid, was considered a terrorist. It is a question of power imbalances in the global system. But why am I saying all these things when I'm supposed to be talking about corruption and perceptions of corruption in Africa? And it is because corruption is also one of the politically pregnant terms, just as Holocaust, just as terrorism, just as genocide. And because Africans don't own the commanding heights of the academy, or even of the polity, or even of the economy, then those who have the ability to define what corruption is, define it in such a way that it hides a lot of realities about what corruption is. So, first of all, what is corruption? You know, this is not an academic audience, even though my PhD supervisor is right here. I'm not going to try to impress him. I think I've impressed him enough. in the last many years. Corruption is simply the abuse of authority for private gain. That is what it is. Of course, it comes in various shapes and forms, but that is what corruption is. Now, based on this definition, or variations of this definition, Transparency International has a corruption index. And according to the 2018 corruption index, I research in terrorism, so I miss the words every now and then. Africa got 32 out of 100, scored 32% out of 100, according to the 2018 terrorism. But then Europe was given 65, between 65 and 70. And for me, that is not on. Or we could accept that maybe as a particular variation of the definition of terrorism is being used here. But in my mind, terrorism is more than just the indicators that these institutions use to measure what corruption is or is not. Now, Africa has been accused of being corrupt, among many other misperceptions about the continent, and a lot of them were raised this morning. A hopeless continent, a continent riddled with diseases, a continent of poverty-stricken people, a continent of all but good. The question is, this definition of corruption that places Africa, gives Africa 32 out of 100, is actually a definition that has come about through a convenient inclusion and exclusion of certain acts. And where do I start? I start from the top. We live in an information age these days, and we are happy to have people who are good at hacking systems, hacking the governmental systems and all of that. So we had in 2014 the Panama Papers, and then later on we had the Paradise Papers, and we know of Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and all of that. And through that, some names have come up as being pretty corrupt. And it is here that my person as an African who has a lot of respect for authority, that I speak with, grudgingly say that even the Queen was implicated in the Paradise Papers as hiding wealth away in tax havens so that she doesn't pay tax. As someone who researches in coloniality, I think the Queen is guilty of a lot of things. Some of the things that she's guilty of are actually inherited guilt from her predecessor queens or kings or princes because of the pillaging of the wealth of the continent. But to want to hide that wealth on top of that, for me, goes to the very depth of what corruption is. Names like even Justin Trudeau, I still like him relatively, but he's also implicated, and even Apple, the company, and people related, connected to the current U.S. president. All these individuals implicated. And then people, people are members of the House of Lords. About 6 of them, or is it 12? Not sure, but a lot of them have been also implicated in these leaks, and including many politicians, businessmen, and all that. Why is that not included in our definition of terrorism? Corruption. Again, because Africa is a lion that hasn't learned to write its own story, and so the stories are always favoring the hunter. There is an Akan proverb that says, "Nia obofo akuhu onwuremu no, and nyina na obafia obeka." What the hunter has seen in the bush when he or she went hunting, the hunter doesn't come home to narrate all that story for you, because all the hunter comes home with is the game, not the struggle between the hunter and the deer or the giraffe or the whatever game that the hunter has succeeded in bringing home. So it's our definition of corruption. Why Africa is deemed to be too corrupt is a question of definition. Now, I am not saying that there are no corrupt leaders and corrupt people in Africa. There are many of them. And I'm not saying that some African governments are not corrupt. A lot of African governments are corrupt. But is corruption unique to Africa? Is Africa inherently corrupt so that corruption is a part of the making of the continent? And this is where my problem is. Maybe you may ask, were Africans not implicated in the Paradise or Panama Papers? Yes, some Africans were also implicated in the Paradise or Panama Papers and even much more other corruption scandals. But the question is, if Africa has already been placed on trial, and if you like, global public opinion is skewed against Africans. Africans are already corrupt. We all have in our minds Africa. I don't want to come and persecute Africa for a second time or even a third time. That would be double jeopardy because the continent is already being tried as being corrupt. So my goal is to show how what we think of as corruption is only a tip of the iceberg. And beneath it is a huge ice that we need to deconstruct, if you like. I had a slide, but apparently the system has decided to fail me, so can't bring that up. I'm forced to resort to my notes. At the time of the Panama Papers in 2014, Barack Obama made a statement that the truth is that, and I'm quoting him, the truth is that all this is legal, and that is the problem. The truth is that all this is legal, and that is the problem. And here, this statement, apart from that, that authority, that Western-centric authority, that authority that Western governments or Western actors have to define what terrorism or what terrorism is not, it's also a question of legality. Why should a legal system that is so human, that is so developed, allow for the wealthy to hide their wealth away and not pay taxes? But to that very statement, I said, exactly, Mr. President, Barack Obama, but what about the lobbyists in Washington? Lobbying has been described as bribery in a suit, where you have lobbyists are either, I have actually a description here. Lobbyists are either individuals or organizations paid well by sections of industry to influence the movers and shakers of Capitol Hill. Fueled by the money of various industries, lobbyists have become the men and women at Washington. The total spending on lobbying has ranged from $1.44 billion in 1998 to $3.3 billion in 2011. And if you look at what lobbyists do, in fact, it is the same things that companies and actors and others in Africa do to gain favors from government. So a comedian joked that why are Africans worrying themselves? They should just replace the word corruption with lobbying and everything will be just fine. But that might be a comedian's argument, but there is a lot of logic in if you sit down to really deconstruct that particular statement. At this point, having mentioned names of Western leaders, leaders in the West, it's also important to also mention some African names that are also related, connected to corruption. One of them is Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, the Lion of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. This this guy, he was so rich than his own country. Yeah, he was very, very rich. That rumors, I'm not verified, rumors had it that he actually wanted to loan his own country some money. Okay? The other name is Jean Bedel Bokassa of the Central African Republic, who had a throne that was supposedly worth more than the GDP of his own country, a throne. Okay? And, of course, General Sani Abacha of Nigeria. You see, the thing with Nigerians is, these days, their names become coterminous with corruption. So if you are in high school and you're doing exams and you are asked to find a word to replace Nigeria, just write corruption. And I think you'll be fine. That is in the psyche of the world. But all these definitions of what corruption is, what it's not, and whether Africa is too corrupt or not, is a question of definition and legality. These men that are just these are actors that I've just mentioned, Mobutu Sese Seko and Jean Bedel Bokassa. These are leaders. Bokassa led a coup supported by France in 1966 against David Dacko, and then became the leader that he was, a corrupt leader. In fact, France continued to support Jean Bedel Bokassa until it was not in their political interest to keep him there, and that was the only time France stepped in to remove Jean Bokassa. Mobutu Sese Seko, an interesting figure, had the support of the US. In fact, he played a key role in the elimination of Patrice Emery Lumumba. And he continued to receive the support of the US and Belgium until the support for him could no longer be sustained. Again, I give you an Akan proverb which says that opininia of your mofraso, ma wacha na nkanwe no, si ye kan na nkanwe fo a ye kan no ka ho bi. This means that if you aid and abet something, you are equally guilty of that particular act. If you aid and abet an act, you are equally guilty of that act. So if we consider Mobutu Sese Seko and Bokassa and Abacha to be very corrupt, and indeed they were, it would be unfair to not also blame the system that accommodated them. Those individuals and structures that allowed them to be corrupt for so long a time that they became so rich, richer than their own countries. But there is yet another issue about this subject of corruption. If our definition of Africa as a corrupt continent is a question of relativity, then that also requires us to really understand the context in which corruption takes place in the continent. Research shows that countries that have experienced colonialism are more at risk of corruption, having corrupt practices. If that is the case, then we cannot also talk about corruption in Africa without bringing in the history of colonialism. You could argue that there are other countries who also suffered colonialism, usually Singapore, the Koreas, and Malaysia, Indonesia they have come up a lot. But the question is, were those countries colonized the same way that Africans were? Were tribes invented in Malaysia as tribes were invented in East Africa? Were native authorities, traditional authorities created in these other places as they were created in places like southeastern Nigeria? My last point that I want to leave you with on this subject of corruption is, it will be interesting to do a little bit of mathematics here. If you compare, if you take, the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence, Sudan, 1956, and then followed by Ghana in 1957. If you compute the age of these very early African countries in the current international dispensation, that is, Ghana will be 62, Sudan will be 63. It will be unfair to compare corruption in Ghana at 52 with corruption in the US at 250. It will be unfair to compare corruption in Ghana as Sudan at 63 with corruption in France many, many years old, or even in the UK many, many years old. And if you go back to the US at 63, or France at 63, then you find that African countries are actually not failed states. It's the other way around, that countries in the West are actually the ones that are failed. Now I'll leave you with this one last mathematical computation on the cost of colonialism, because I do believe that corruption and all the problems that we speak about, regarding Africa, they happen in a context. And that issue of slavery and colonialism have a lot to do with the current situation that we have in Africa. So maybe if the Western world, those who are doing the definition, the hunters of the world, if they pay back African continent somehow, how much they have taken away, perhaps Africa will be able to solve its so-called corruption problem, or its problem of poverty, or its other problem. So how much do the Western world, those who colonized Africa, how much do they owe Africa? One scholar put a figure to that, and it is 321 quadrillion. I can't even pronounce it because, in fact, I need to have saliva in my mouth to be able to maneuver that particular word. In case you are allergic to numbers as much as I am, that figure is over 10,000 times the 2013 GDP of all colonizers of Africa. 10,000 times the 2013 GDP of all Europeans who colonized Africa. Maybe when we have that money back into the continent, we could use it to solve those issues of poverty, corruption, and other issues. Thank you.